We do this every once in a while just to give them the opportunity to experience worship with us and with their parents, and just to see what it is when adults gather together for worship. So we're really glad that you're also in with us this morning. If you're a guest with us today, thank you. We're glad that you're here. And if this is your first time, or if you've been here a few times, please feel comfortable. Sit back, think about what we're going to talk about today, see if it resonates with you, and maybe at the end you're going to think about maybe I should kind of consider this following Jesus thing. Many of you have known me for a while and know that I have a special fondness for cat videos. Not so much. But I thought I would entertain us. Hopefully we got this through. Let's see if the cat video is ready. Yep, there you go. How many of you feel so much better now? Now, the first one's actually kind of entertaining. It was a little blurry. The cat actually strikes out at a crocodile, alligator, whichever that is, and pushes it back in the water. I just think that's priceless, because you're thinking, he's going to eat that cat. Anyway, for all you cat lovers, you're fine, and all those that were hoping that the cat was going to get it, you're disappointed. I want to show you something about this, because there's actually a rhyme to the reason, not just entertainment value. So we have a screen of that kind of shot from off YouTube, and I want you to notice, if you can read it, sorry, it's a little blurry, the number of views of that cat video. Can anybody read it? 124,226,854 views. Now, it's a compilation video, and so it's long. It's actually about 13 or 14 minutes long. And I actually scrolled through, you can do the comments below, and there's actually a person who commented, and their response was, "Why am I up at 4 a.m. watching cat videos?" And then, of course, my response is, "Why are you posting that? Like, go to bed." Now, once again, we have a reason for this, because I'm also going to let you see a link to our YouTube page. Here we go. That's our sermon. I got a lot of stuff on there. And so, how many of you have ever even looked at this? Thank you. A few. I don't know what the average is. I didn't take time to average it out, but my average sermon video is about 10. If you just want to feel depressed in life, that's a good way to go at it, isn't it? There's actually one on this page I actually brought up. It says Family Feud there. There is 223 views, and I was thinking, yeah, until I realized people accidentally got there because they Googled YouTube video, and they ended up there, and they opened it up and went, "This is a sermon. What am I doing here?" And they closed it, right? Just for everybody's knowledge, our kids' Easter and Christmas thing that they did, where they were up here and they were really cute, they outperformed me by about 100% to sometimes about 300%. And our blooper video actually outperformed most of my sermons. I know, you can laugh. It's okay. Feel free. The reason I think it's kind of entertaining, I think most people view sermons as kind of minority stuff. It's not really what people are going to YouTube to look for, at least not apparently 124 million people. Which raises the question about kind of where we are in our world with what we listen to. And I want you guys kind of begin to think this through. Today's sermon is going to be probably a little bit for us to think about. It's kind of a thinking sermon. And I want you to think really carefully with me today. See if it kind of, once again, resonates with you and maybe where God's leading us. There's also one more page I want to show you. This is our a way for you to get connected with what we're doing with music. And Pastor Laura has been putting these on for a couple times. If you are a YouTube person, you can subscribe to the church channel. If you do that, then you'll get these playlists, which basically is all the songs that we're doing in this series of sermons. And if you go, I never know the songs. Well, this is a great way. I've been actually just listening to it at home while I'm just kind of bored and listening to these, and it's really been helping me. So if you want to do that, I will encourage you that one of the songs that we're going to sing, matter of fact, the song we're going to sing at the end today had 24 million views already. So it's impacting some people. Last week, we began to talk about embracing change. And then kind of use this kind of illustration that some things are unchangeable and some things will change. And we talked about last week how the church was very adaptable, the early church. Looking in the book of Acts and how the early church was able to make impressive, radical changes to its culture, the way it expressed the gospel of Jesus Christ, but yet they were unshakable on the gospel itself. And today we want to keep looking into that topic. And today I want to guide us into this thought. I want you to think with me for a few moments the history of English-speaking countries. So primarily we're going to be thinking about England, Canada, the U.S., South Africa, Australia. If you have spoken English, or if you're of English heritage, speaking heritage, there's been kind of a commonality with that. And that common thing is that, for the most part, Christianity has been the majority voice of the English language. Almost any of those countries, at least historically, Christianity was the predominant and usually vastly predominant voice. Not just religious voice, just moral voice, often involved in politics, often involved in radically shaping culture. It is evident from the beginnings of Canada that there were significant religious overtones in the way that our country was founded, even with going up to even in the last major documents that were done in the 60s and the 80s, in which still there's this kind of surrendering to the dominance or the position of God in our society. The reality, though, is there is a change afoot. That is radically being altered in our society. And while normally most people would think, oh, now he's going to talk about, how we need to change that. That is not where I'm going. And matter of fact, that's not really the point of this sermon. I'm not even sure it's the right point. Here's what is the reality, is that slowly, over the last 35 to 50 years, Christianity has become the minority voice. And I need to kind of describe that because that has a lot of different connotations to that. I don't necessarily mean this in some kind of political format. That's not actually what I'm looking for. Matter of fact, I kind of gave up on that years ago, in the 1980s, where I was part of, as you guys, many of you know, I was part of the United States, and I was part of the moral majority, if anybody has ever heard that term before. And I realized at that point that change doesn't really take place that way in society. That's really not how God formed His church, to make moral transitions. And so I kind of gave up on that view. What I do mean by minority is this, that every part of our society now, schools, governments, both federal, provincial, and local governments, businesses, the truest sense is most of those places the Christian voice is absent. And once again, I don't even mean this in a really antagonistic or even hostile way. What I mean by this is that the message of Jesus is just not known. It's just not brought up. And if there is a sense of that, that's supposed to be a very private part of who we are. If you want to believe that or do that, that's fine. Just do that on your own time, your own space. Don't bring that to me. In the truest sense, we have become a secular society. For most people, and listen to me carefully, for most people that would call themselves Canadian, the gospel of Jesus is first of all foreign. In other words, it's outside of their experience. They haven't experienced this. They don't know someone who's deeply connected with Jesus, living that out in front of them. So it's a very foreign concept to them. It's not only foreign, but it's also, in their perception, unneeded. We have been telling the kind of the story in our culture for many years that by nature, humanity is really, really good. If there is a problem, it's usually a cultural problem or maybe a family problem. But by nature, I am good. And therefore, the message that I need to be saved makes no sense whatsoever. Saved from what? Besides this, it is a very strange message. And I don't want this to sound offensive to us, but what I'm trying to do is help it. What does it sound like to other people? And the gospel is this idea that somehow Jesus comes and He dies on a cross, and somehow that pays the penalty for my sin so that I can now be reconnected with God. And for those that haven't grown up with that, it sounds like this: the cross, death, brings life? What? I remind you of a verse of Scripture that we read last week when Paul taught this to Athenians years ago, thousands of years ago. It said this, that they responded with this: "You bring some strange things to our ears." And that's the way that most people are understanding the Christian gospel now. Now, our normal response, I think, historically, at least for many years, has been to be very fearful in this moment when we think, yeah, it shouldn't be this way. Well, that may be the case, but this is where we are. And here's the good news. I want you to think this through with me. Nowhere in the New Testament is the Church of Jesus Christ given instructions on how to live as the powerful majority in society. We're not told how to take over governments and rule from a kind of a political perspective and to force people into believing. And if you look back through Western society and you think, what are the ugliest moments? The ugliest moments of church life is when we have gotten to that spot. And then we have tried to figure out how to be this powerful, aggressive majority. The good news is also this, that although there's no scriptures on how to be the majority, there's an abundance of Scripture on how we are to live passionately, courageously, as the minority voice in the world. I want you to begin to kind of wrap your head around that. I think this is the reason why the church has often found it hard to live in that kind of majority world. We tend to lose our passion. We tend to become apathetic. We tend to lose our humility, our courage. We struggle then to give up the ease of being the majority voice. And I want to challenge you, this is hard because I've been wrestling around with this for a while in my head going, what makes this so hard for us in this transition that we're in our world? And part of it is giving up that sense of being normal. I go tell somebody about Jesus and they look at me like I've got an extra head. There's nothing fun about that. There's nothing fun about somebody looking at you going, "Are you serious?" "Yeah, I am." "You really believe in something after this life?" "I really do." "And you believe I can be connected with God?" As one person on one website said, Christians and their make-believe friend. That's their view of our view of God. Once again, I don't mean this in any way to have this hostility, because I think that has been all too often this kind of fear kind of approach to this problem, this place where we find ourselves. The church is at its best when it's humble, it's suffering, it's courageous, and it's the minority voice, at least as I see it in the world today and as we look through history. Let's take a peek in the early church in Acts chapter 16. When we look in the book of Acts, one of the things that becomes very clear from the very beginning of the book of Acts going forward, at the church was always the minority voice no matter where it was. It begins in Jerusalem, where it was definitely the minority voice, and began to grow. It grows to where it's too big, it becomes a little bit too influential, and so persecution breaks out, and they thin it out. Those Christians go everywhere. We end the book of Acts with Paul in Rome, absolutely the minority voice, standing before Nero, giving his defense before Nero as absolutely a lonely person, minority voice. And yet already before he gets there, he's already done such an effective job sharing the gospel that even some of the household of Caesar had become Christ followers. So they were always the minority voice in the New Testament. This is, in fact, the only way they understood church. They couldn't wrap their head around any other view of church. In this chapter, in Acts chapter 16, here's what it says. And we're going to pick up the story of Paul going to Greece, when he first goes into Greece, into the area of Macedonia. And from there to Philippi, which is the leading city of the district of Macedonia, a Roman colony. We remained in this city some days, and on the Sabbath day we went outside to the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. When we pick up the story, we realize that once again we're in one of these great transitions. Paul had been in Asia Minor, where there was an incredible influence in the synagogue. That was both a positive and negative experience for Paul, where many times the synagogue was a place to foster the growing church, but also was many times a place of conflict with the Jews. He goes to this leading city. This is an important kind of concept. He goes to the leading city of this province, Macedonia. This is where Alexander was from, this city of Philippi. And in this city that's this large, there was no synagogue. That's actually the reason they went to the river, because when he says he's thinking there might be a place of prayer, that's where the Jews would meet. If there was no synagogue, they would kind of meet at the river on the Sabbath day, look for one another, and try to connect with people who had like-mindedness. They believed in monotheism. They believed in the law. And so Paul goes to the river to try to meet someone. The only person he meets is a lady. And she's not even from Philippi. She's moved there from someplace else. That lets you know how foreign the culture was to Christianity that Paul was in. He was definitely in the minority where he was now. Picking up the story in verse 14, and one who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. So she probably wasn't even really Jewish. She was probably a Gentile who'd kind of converted to Judaism. Important verse. And the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. Lydia had moved in this area, and she had brought this search for God to this town, major metropolitan city. And as far as Paul knows, there's one family looking to find out more about God. One person that he could kind of figure out how to connect with. Verse 16, and they were going to the place of prayer, where we met by a slave girl who had the spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain in fortune-telling. You talk about a radically different culture than what they had grown up with, or what Paul had grown up with. He was now saturated with a very different worldview and very different voices. Here the voices is that of fortune-telling, that of kind of spiritual stuff. And we're going to speak a lot about that in the next couple of weeks, about how Paul had to confront this kind of stuff. But there's definitely in this moment a conflict of voices. The idea of a monotheistic God who's the creator of everything, who controls everything, is absolutely, sounds like a third head thing to these people. And it definitely conflicts with the majority voice. When the owners find out that Paul has released this woman from her spiritual bondage, he gets in trouble. They weren't happy. They weren't excited for her. They were going to lose money. This was the way they made money. This was their culture. And all of a sudden it was changing, and they weren't happy. And here's where we pick up the story in Acts chapter 16, verse 19. But when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or to practice." It's an interesting accusation, because in some ways the accusation was true. It was foreign. It was completely foreign to them. It was absolutely foreign to those who were Romans. Now, the Philippines, they weren't Romans, but they were a Roman city, and they definitely wanted to make sure that the Romans knew they were on their side. They were following the kind of religious commands of Rome, which would, there's really no Caesar, and there's no God but Caesar. There's no king but Caesar. And if there's gods, there's a lot of them, not one. We're not going to surrender to one God. 1 Corinthians is a letter that Paul, this person who's on this trip, in Philippi now, he writes a few years later, but it really illustrates this moment of where he begins to understand this new culture. In 1 Corinthians, here's what he says about the Greek world that he's come into. He said, "For since the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom." In other words, you can't get a hold of God through intellectual pursuit alone. And here's what he says: "It pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand a sign and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block, a real hindrance to Jews, an absolute foolishness, folly to Gentiles. But those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." See, Paul had come to really grab a hold of this, that the central part of Christianity made no sense to many people. It was a minority view. People weren't all going to flock around and go, "You know, I kind of like the sound of that. That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not really going to follow Jesus, but I really respect your view. It really sounds pretty close to right." No, that's not what they viewed it. They viewed it as absolute foolishness. A man dying and somehow that helps me with my sin? This makes no sense for them. Paul is explaining the truth that he has learned. The gospel is not passed on by those means. And this truth that Paul had learned isn't just for New Testament times. Matter of fact, all across our world and all throughout history, this truth has been coming through over and over again. The truth that the minority voice is the way that God works in this world. Today, Christians in Egypt, Iran, Russia, India, China, and many, many other places all understand the role of the church as the minority voice in society. Not against society, not antagonistic against society, but loving and gracious to society, knowing that it is their role to bring about this truth, that we can know God because of Jesus. This voice of pointing to the way of Christ, pointing out how to find Christ, pointing out how to connect with Him, even when it doesn't make sense to a lot of people, it will make sense to some. Welcome to being the minority voice. I had a person, I was talking about this sermon, they said, "Well, how? How do we do that?" And that's where I want you to think with me for a few moments, because this is one of the things that we need to learn how to grasp, how to do. This is where we're going to be probably for the rest of our lives. I hope there's a great revival. I hope there's a great change. But we at least need to prepare ourselves. Here's a couple thoughts. First of all, I would encourage us as Christ followers to embrace the role as the minority voice in society. Once again, we talked about it last week, not cursing change, not being exhausted by change, but embracing that God has often put His people in the role of the minority voice. Listen, Acts chapter 16, verse 25 and 26. When Paul and Silas, they were once again arrested because of this girl being freed. Here's their response to it. At midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prisons were shaken. I want you to think about this moment. These guys just got arrested. We found out, if you read the whole story, they've been beaten. And here they are worshiping in prison, enjoying the evening, enjoying one another, and having hymns sing. Because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus. Being mocked. And that's part of the minority voice, embracing that. You're not always going to be accepted by everyone. Okay. The second thing is to embrace this reality, embrace this truth that God is working to save people. There are salvific opportunities, moments of salvation all around us, and Paul and Silas are in one of these. So the jailer, moving on, after the earthquake, the jailer woke up and saw that the prison doors were open. He drew his sword and was about to kill himself. I want to ask you right now, what would you do in that moment? What would be your response? Perfect. I'm out of here. As soon as he dies, I'm gone. Supposing that the prisoners had escaped, but Paul cried out in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. See, what Paul understood in this moment, God was about to do something salvific. God was going to save somebody. God was going to have this opportunity to save this jailer. And that was foremost what was on Paul's mind, not about how he could get out of prison. How could he avoid this kind of minority thing where he's always getting in trouble? I want you just to think about your world that you're in, where you work, where you walk, where you go to school, where you travel, where you go to the grocery store. All around you, God is already actually at work, acting, working in the lives of people. Your responsibility is to say, God, where's the salvation opportunities? Who is ready? Who do I need to speak to? Who's my response supposed to go to? Acts chapter 16, verse 31. He keeps going on, the jailer. He says, then he, the jailer, brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? And they said, believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household. I want you to just challenge this view, challenge our worldview, that the world is not a place of comfort, but a place of opportunity. It is a place of opportunity, just like in this moment that Paul and Silas had, to bring salvation to those who do not know Jesus. The next thing we should be thinking about is this response. You should be praying for those kind of moments. You should be praying on an ongoing basis, God, please do work around me. Surround me with what you're doing. Help me to see it. Maybe even this, do miraculous things around me. Earlier in the book of Acts, there was another moment where Paul was busy, and he was before some leaders of the government, and a miracle took place, and here's the response of the governors. And when the proconsuls believed, and then the proconsuls believed, when he saw what had occurred, for he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. I want you to think about this for a moment. It was this miraculous moment where truth was verified by miraculous. The leaders saw and they believed in the power of God. Miracles, powerful acts point to the truth of Jesus. See, and I think for many of us, if we're not careful, we begin to think of the miraculous as more means of personal comfort. I don't want to be sick. I don't want to struggle. I don't want to be put out. So I want God to come in and take all that away. And the book of Acts primarily shows those things, not exclusively, but primarily as ways to verify what the disciples were saying. So I want to encourage you, if you've been sharing your faith with anyone, and it's really not sinking in, the next step is really, God, please bring about one of these moments where you can show yourself to them, however you want to do that. The next one that I think is important to where we are is how do we live in the minority voice is this one. Remember your story. Remember and we use the word testimony. It may not make any sense, that word, but really what God's been doing in you. What we've been reading is the Acts of the Apostles. In other words, the good things that God had been doing in the lives of the early Christ followers. My question for you is, what is your Acts? What has Christ been doing in your life? Do you remember it? Or do you tend to forget it? Do they tend to slip into the past and we forget all about them? Today, one of the things we're going to do before you leave is we're going to try to draw those back to memory. I want you to know I've already prayed for you. That if you've had those moments where you and God have truly intersected in this world and you went, wow, that was a God moment, that God's going to remind you of this today. What is your story between you and God? What would you say to someone if they said, is God real? Oh yeah, let me tell you about what happened when I was 17 years old. I lived in Billings, Montana. I was going through the worst time of my life. I thought my world was completely coming apart. First time I had ever considered suicide. Standing on a street corner in Billings, Montana, I hear this voice saying, just step off into oncoming traffic. No one cares about you. And the next moment, I heard a voice that said, I love you. You mean so much to me. Step away. I will show you how much I care for you. And in that moment, my life took a completely different turn. I changed schools. I changed vocation. The reason I am here today in front of you is because of that moment. Not just because it saved my life, but it changed my direction in life. I want you to know God has met with me many times. I wonder, has He met with you in such a way? These are the things that will help us be able to confirm the truth of Jesus to other people. The next thing I want to challenge you with is this idea. A minority voice understands that we invite, not we coerce. We do not have the ability to pressure or to force or to manipulate when you're the minority voice. But this is what makes Christianity work, is the minority voice, because it has always been built upon invitation. Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee saying, come, follow me. It is the very same thing that Jesus says to people in this room today. Come, follow me. See if I'm worth following. Let's find out. Let's live with one another. This is the whole story of Jesus. So this is the reason why we should begin to rethink what we mean by that. We don't mean invite people to church, even though that's a great thing. I mean much more drastic approach to life and relationship. We invite people into relationship. We show people that we want to be in relationship with them and that God wants to relate with them, that He is inviting them into life with them. Simple phrases like this. Can I share what God is doing in my life? And you think, we're not supposed to do that anymore. That's pretty safe. If somebody's offended by that, they're pretty easily offended. Can I just tell you what God's doing for me? I'm not really in the God thing. Oh, okay. Can I pray for you? It looks like you might need some prayer right now. Please. I've only had one person ever in my life turn that down. One person in my entire life say, no, I don't believe in prayer. Okay. Everyone else has said, please pray for me. This is the approach of the minority of voice. We invite people. It is invitational because that's the way God has always been. The other kind of perspective on the approach in the minority of voice is this one. Humble yet unashamed. The majority voice comes in as powerful and aggressive, and we will make these things happen. We will use political clout, and we will bring transformation of our governments and society through laws. The humble voice sounds very different. And yet that humble voice is completely unashamed of the message of Jesus Christ. Even to those it doesn't make a lot of sense to. I want you to understand the rest of this story because it's really an important part of the story. Paul has been beaten. He's been put in prison. The jailer has been saved. The next morning, they're going to let them go. And Paul says, well, there's one small problem. Here's what he says. Acts chapter 16, verse 37. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison, and now they want to throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. So in this moment, this unashamed man who was willing to take a beating for Christ also is courageously standing up for his rights. He's not weak. This is not doormat Christianity. He understood his rights and stood and used them and appealed to them in occasions when it made sense. Paul didn't appeal to them all the time, but he appealed to them in occasions when it made sense. And it did in this occasion. I think he probably did it so that at the end the jailer wouldn't get in trouble anymore. I want you to think through all of these thoughts about what this means. Why were they unashamed of the gospel? And why should we be unashamed of the gospel? Even if it doesn't make sense to a lot of people in our society, it's really simple. The gospel are the words of life. They're the words that bring life. There's no evidence that the way we are going away from Christianity is bringing a better society or life. There's more brokenness in our world than ever. More anger than ever. Is this working? No, not really. Jesus can bring life. Next week, we're going to add one more to these, and this is about living a godly life in front of other people so that our testimony has some validity. We're going to pick that back up next week. But I want to finish up with this as the worship team's coming. I want you to begin to think with me about this for you. The disciples were unashamed because they knew for certain the gospel was the words of life. I want you to begin to reflect upon your life with Christ, your life with God. Even if right now you'd say, well, I'm not really a Christ follower. That's okay. I want to ask you right now, have you ever had any moments in your life where you went, was that God? How did that just happen? How did that miraculously just take place? How did I not hit that vehicle? I'm confused. I don't know. As if somebody outside of me was protecting me or helping me. I want you to begin to ask, has that actually taken place for you? And if it is, this is the interaction of God and man. If you are a Christ follower, I would like for you to begin to think through many of the occasions where you came to know Christ, where you've experienced an interaction with Christ, where He has spoken to you, saved you, healed you, redeemed you from a bad situation, provided for you. I would like for you to begin to wrestle around with those. If someone's close to you that you know and you're comfortable with, even during the middle of this song, I'd like for you to share one of those with somebody. Yeah, I remember the time when. Begin to think that through. This is really the heartbeat of your testimony, God's interaction with you. What am I supposed to share with people? I don't know what to share. Your story of God living with you, saving you, and helping you. Let's pray and think.